Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tex Messages, the Resurrection. I'm the parasite of the show, Rick Tex. We're glad to be here on this Monday evening, December 10th, 2018. We're getting into the throngs of winter, and in looks like about a week and a half will be the shortest day of the year. Now, that may not hold a lot of significance to most of you at home, ladies and gentlemen, but ironically, the longest day of the year happened to be the same day where a few individuals entered into my existence. So it proved to me that potentially things don't always happen based on coincidence. There could also be a more fourth dimensional meaning to the occurrences that happen in your everyday life, ladies and gentlemen. And there's been some theories and hypotheses floating around that you have this thing inside of you called the pineal gland. And what that is apparently a third eye into other godly dimensions and forms of communication and everything. But what actually happens when you consume fluoride and other dangerous contaminants like that, it calcifies your pineal gland. So it's an antenna that resonates with other dimensions, so that then you're not able to communicate with them when you consume fluoride and bromide and chloride and things of that nature, those halogens that are not good for iodide. Though iodide is great for you. It's a very critical component. Iodized salt, apparently that's the junk compound, so it's best to get it in a nascent form, a liquid form, rather than the the adulterated potassium, the version that's bonded with the potassium. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's just a good idea to pay attention to clean water. And currently I am doing a little bit of research into clean water, because over the weekend I had to change water softeners, because what happened is the old water softener would still regenerate and appear to be working properly, but the water was not being softened. So apparently it wasn't really doing its job. It'd be like if people show up for work and they go there but they don't do anything. They go there, it appears that they're busy, but they're really not doing anything. That's kind of what the water softener how it was acting. So eventually I had to go ahead and get an upgraded version from Menards and slap that on, and now the water is soft as silk. But one of the things that I did discover is that, and I don't really want to get into this on today's episode, probably maybe Wednesdays, which probably won't be updated to YouTube until Thursday. But I did find out that it is a good idea to drink water prior to the water softener. But we'll get into that in a later date, ladies and gentlemen. As far as today, obviously we have other vital and important topics to discuss, so we'll delve into that a little bit. So, getting into some of the research projects. Well, actually, we don't have any projects going on around here. But getting into some research that was done on ScienceDaily.com. A couple scientists at Purdue found a new polymer which allows plastic to function in high temperatures and also act as an electrical conductor. Most electronics function around minus 40 to 85 degrees Celsius, but this new polymer is able to conduct electricity up to 428 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, one of the things to know about a resistor, or a piece of, not really, I shouldn't say a resistor. One of the things to know about copper, which is a common conductor of electricity, the more it heats up, the more it expands. And the more it expands, the more resistance it creates, because it requires the current, the amperages, more room to move their current and their energy, their power. Think of, say, a river, for example. If you spread the river, or probably a better example would be if you have multiple people passing pineapples amongst each other, and then you spread those people apart, so they have to pass the pineapples a further distance away. As opposed to just spreading them in a straight crystallized line, that they're spread out, so they're passing the pineapples in one direction and the other direction. So it's going to take them a longer time to pass the pineapple. There are some good videos out there where they're illustrating the manufacturing, not really manufacturing, but the picking of pineapples, and then they basically literally just hand them off one to the other. Maybe they do the same with coconuts and pumpkins and acorn squash too, but pineapple is a pretty fair example. So when you get a copper resistor which is not really a resistor, it's called a conductor. See, there's a certain threshold where you have insulators and resistors. Like silicone, for example, is an insulator. Plastic and rubber, insulators. Metal, steel, iron, copper, gold, silver, conductors. So when the conductors heat up, they typically have a higher resistivity. Now, you may notice that in the wintertime, it takes your battery a lot more energy to start your car or things of that nature. The main reason for that is the oil is thicker, it has a higher viscosity, so then it does literally take more energy to spin your engine. But the other factor too, when the resistance in the cables increases, then the voltage drops, so then the current needs to go up too, and as the current increases, it takes more power out of the battery, because when it creates higher current creates the heat, which heats up the cables, and it creates more resistance. So it's like a snowball effect. Things just keep getting worse and worse. So, one moment, ladies and gentlemen. Alright, pardon that interruption, ladies and gentlemen. We had had some maintenance to do around the house here, and it was rather urgent and unexpected. So, now we're back to the show. So copper, we have conductors and resistors. Now, you may have heard of a superconductor. What a superconductor is, they take lithium, helium, or liquid helium, or whatever the case may be, and cool something down so it's almost absolute zero. Absolute zero is a measure of temperature based on the units of Kelvin. 273 Kelvin is 0 degrees Celsius, so minus a lot of degrees Celsius would be 0 degrees Kelvin, which is absolute zero. That's why it gets its name. So that's when a conductor can become a superconductor. And I mean they test it out with the power lines and things of that nature too. So I mean the power lines are basically just big copper cables, but since they're out in the sky, so that when they're in a conduit in an enclosed area, they generate more heat. But when they're up in the sky, they're super high voltages as well, so they don't carry as much current, because power is voltage times current. And the current is what creates the energy, or the power loss, and the heat. So if there's super duper high voltage, the current can be very low, and even though you're still transmitting a lot of power, you're not creating a lot of energy loss in the lines. So that's why the power lines have asinine amount of power, but they're not that big. And they're out in the open too, so the power that they do dissipate can just output itself into the air, the atmosphere. If they're in a closed conductor, in a closed conduit, they would not be able to do that. For example, if you have piping, or if you have a furnace that has 60 amps or whatever, fuses, and the expected current draws 30 amps, so with a 60 amp fuse, maybe you'd have to get wire that's rated for 80 amps. So let's say you get wire that would be called 2 watt. If it's in a conduit, it has to be 2 watt, but if it's out in the open, then it might only have to be a 3 gauge or something. So, or a 4 gauge or whatever the case may be. So it does make a pretty big difference. I mean, you don't want to start fires, you don't want to melt the insulation around the outside of the conductors. So that's just one thing to consider. Now getting back to the research article here, what they found is that they were creating a ratio of plastic to a conductor, silicone for example. Basically all microelectronics and integrated circuit boards are made from silicone. Like the silicone transistor. You may remember the days of vacuum tube transistors where you got like this big cube cylinder looking thing. Nowadays they're able to make that big cube cylinder looking thing with a gas tube in it into a little tiny chip that fits, you could probably fit dozens of them on your pinky finger. That's why electronics have gotten so much small since the good old days, just because the transistor. When Jack Kilby discovered the transistor, then everything went to microelectronics and nano. Now we're having nanotechnology, and probably in another dozen years it'll be picotechnology and then femtotechnology, and then who knows what's beyond that. But maybe the Earth will be destroyed by some globalist by the time that would happen. But technology, I mean, it just keeps getting smaller and smaller because you can fit less, or you can fit more and more on a smaller space. Now, if you've ever seen these copper circuit boards, say you pull apart a TV or a phone or an insanely expensive camera used to film YouTube videos, what you find is that they have a lot of circuit boards, maybe not a lot of circuit boards, but a few circuit boards in it, or just one circuit board. And those circuit boards may have up to a dozen layers of copper on them. They put a copper layer on, piece of fiberglass or silicone, conductor, insulator, conductor, and then they poke holes through it, and then they're able to poke holes down to the third layer, and then on the third layer they have a circuit board that communicates with whatever's on the first layer that poked a hole through it, and so on and so forth. So you can pretty much fit the entire Apollo 11 spacecraft onto a little 2 by 2 foot, probably few layer microchip or whatever the case may be. I mean, that's just how much electronics have advanced since the 60s when the moon landing happened, and apparently electronics still aren't good enough to have another moon landing, even though they've advanced significantly. So, just from discovering one crucial component like miniaturizing a transistor or a metal oxide semiconducting effect field transistor, just one component like that changes an entire industry, and it allows innovation in every facet of technological gain. You have cameras with better performance, TVs with better performance, cars with better performance, microwaves with better performance, ovens, stoves, everything that has electrical components in it, a cell phone for example. So that's why it's always very important to, they call them quote unquote disruptive technologies, but it's just very important to always make sure that there's an avenue to create and to innovate and to foster people to discover these disruptive technologies and to bring them to the plebeiessence or the peasants like us, or like me especially, or a parasite too. So a lot of universities do a lot of the research that is intended to discover these monumental, massive achievements, one giant leap for mankind, mostly so that they can get patents on it, and then with the patents, then they can draw a lot of money into their research projects. But usually, unfortunately, what ends up happening is this: a lot of companies universities get research money from state grants or federal grants, whatever the case may be, and not a whole lot really comes out of it. Now, that's not to undermine the efforts of the men and women doing all these tests and studies and experimentations and theoretical and hypotheses, but it's just, when things do, I mean, if there was an extraordinary discovery like harnessing energy through quarks or through some tachyons flying through the earth, and then it would put the oil and natural gas companies out of business. I mean, whether there is actually something like that could be practical or not is certainly up for debate. But even if there was, it would be a very far stretch to just push it out in the public right away and let everybody enjoy it. I mean, nuclear power back in the 30s and 40s, it was supposed to be this big extraordinary thing that was going to get us off of fossil fuels and natural gas and everything. And I mean, yeah, it is pretty decent. I mean, it's pretty good at powering submarines and big giant aircraft carriers, and for power plants it seems to work pretty good too, but if they're poorly maintained and if they're built near fault lines, then yeah, obviously you're going to have some problems. But I mean, we need energy, so if we can get it from nuclear and do whatever with the nuclear spent fuel rods, then by all means it'd be great. But there always seems to be some kind of trade-off, and the one fundamental understanding is that pretty much all of our energy comes from the sun in some capacity. I mean, if you think about all of the plants that died and all the animals that died and decayed and turned into fossil fuels, that all came from energy that they got from plants. All the animals that they ate and everything, the photosynthesis, that came from energy that was initially taken from the sun. And then you get your wind, which is essentially created by differentials in pressure in the atmosphere that is created by the sun, ultimately. And then, of course, you just get the sun shining all their rays on us, then heating us up and everything, and energizing our solar panels and things of that nature, too. And then, obviously, that's directly attributed to the sun. So, yeah, I mean, it's the most efficient path to energy independence and efficient consumption is just to get it directly from the sun. So if you can get solar panels 90% efficient, you bypass all that other junk. Oh yeah, wind turbines would be pretty good too. I mean, the wind is a pretty direct path to the sun too. But I mean, extracting fossil fuels out of the ground that have decayed from thousands of years ago, that is more of a transitional technology. Now, it could take 100, 200, 300 years, but what that allows for is that people to utilize energy so that they can live in cold climates like Minnesota. I mean, without coal to power all these lights in here, and without, gas to drive cars to and from work and to warm up car before driving to work, it would be very, very challenging to live in the deep north, in Elk River, Minnesota, which is 3 hours south of Duluth. So that's why we need the transitional technologies like the fossil fuels to get us to the point where we can, create enough of an environment that fosters free thought and enterprise and people to be creative and to innovate and to build a system of energy retrieval and harnessing that will allow us to live in perpetuity with the sun, as closely as we can with the sun. And that goes for the longest day of the season. The longest day of the season, you have the most amount of sun, the most amount of energy available to you. So that's where you get the most of your life from. Now that doesn't mean just throw winter under the bus. It is very important to be a winter soldier, and you're always going to have to deal with trials and tribulations in this existence too. Because I mean, when you think about it, living in the deep north, you have to innovate in ways that people living in San Francisco maybe won't have to. I mean, in here in Minnesota, geothermal heating is a pretty big thing. Solar it's catching on, but it's not massive. Wind is pretty prevalent in the south parts of the country and in the south part of Minnesota and in Iowa because it's a high wind zone there. But I mean, something like geothermal heating, nobody in Texas is going to care about geothermal heating. But for people in Minnesota, it'd be great. It'd be a very effective way to save on their energy costs. And it would be very long term too if the construction is built properly, and the center core of the earth is probably always going to be pretty hot. So if you can get down there a few miles, 60, 70 degrees, get that air up here in the wintertime, that'd be perfect. So that's probably another good source of efficient energy as well. The only problem with that is the initial upfront costs are very expensive because you got to buy pretty heavy duty tooling to dig a hole that deep. And then there's probably a lot of city code and ordinances, municipality, state code, federal code that you got to deal with, which definitely creates more elements of challenge there too. Once you start having to deal with human law, legality elements, then I don't know the first thing about laws. I know the Big Ten as far as laws go and commandments, but beyond that, yeah, I'm pretty much just navigating in the Aokogi forest in Japan. So not really my strength too. But I mean, ultimately, just being as close to the sun as possible. It helps you synthesize vitamin D. It's good to be outside. It's good to be outside at nighttime too. So I mean, that doesn't mean just completely throw that under the bus and discount that as well. But it looks like we're coming up to the conclusion of the show, ladies and gentlemen. So hopefully Wednesday we got a big show planned about clean water and how best to what water you should be drinking and what water will make you great again. Now we looked into rainwater a little bit and well water. It looks like the general conclusion is probably a little bit of both. See, I used to be under the assumption that rainwater was superior. No, not entirely sure. Plants clearly think it's superior. So based on that, you would think that humans would probably think it's superior as well. But it's hard to say because there is a good argument for well water. One of the reasons why is because humans are able to synthesize a lot of vitamins, but minerals you have to get that from the ground. And if you can get that from well water and decayed and evaporated or decayed rocks, then that's probably about your only option, which is why you're not able to get the minerals from the sky, but you're able to get the minerals from the ground. But from the sky, you can get whatever is necessary for human survival. Oxygen, maybe a bit of nitrogen, and whatever else it has. Energy from the gods in heavens above. So Wednesday, we should have a good one, a big one planned for you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this evening. We salute you.